Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Naturalist Notes webinar series. My name is Susie, and I'm the Programs and Operations Director with Friends of the Dunes. I'm my co-host.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to figure out the mute button here. Yeah, I'm Daisy Embry-Spedis, and I'm the Outreach Manager with Friends of the Dunes.
Great, thanks for being here for our third webinar of 2022. Oh, I can't seem to progress my slides. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so I want to begin by acknowledging that Friends of the Dunes and our staff are working and living on the unceded territory of the Wiyot people, which include the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Wiyot people have continue to be the working stewards of our lands, waterways, air, plants, and animals of the ancestral homelands, which include the stretch of lands between Pulut Gasamuli, Little River, and Raski Uwit, Bear River Ridge, since time immemorial. The Wiyot people have survived the violent colonization and genocide and attempted erasure of their culture and people. Today, I want to share this wonderful website called honortax.org. I can put that in the chat box in a few. Through this website, you can give an honor tax to the Wiyot. So an honor tax is kind of a monetary way of recognizing and respecting their native sovereignty, kind of a monetary acknowledgement that you are living on their traditional territory. So on your screen, you'll be able to see place names for locations near Wiki, Humboldt Bay, and Sulatluk, the Wiyot language. I'm joining you from Jerujiji, Eureka. I would love to hear in the chat box where everyone is tuning in from. If you know the ancestral lands, if you know the name, that would be awesome. And please remember to toggle the blue button in the chat box to include both the panelists and the attendees. So for each webinar, we will be introducing a Sulatluk word of the day. Today it is Shiruwak, meaning butterfly. And on your screen, there is a QR code, and you can scan that in using your smartphone camera, and then you can listen to Della Prince. She was a native speaker, and you can hear the actual pronunciation of the word. Yeah, so Friends of the Dunes is a nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving the natural diversity of our coastal environments through community-supported education and stewardship programs.
And this webinar series supports the Coastal Naturalist Training, which is a California Naturalist certification course. We were able to safely offer this program completely in person in 2021, and we are cautiously optimistic that we will be able to do it again in 2022. So that would be starting in September and running through October. It is an 8-week program total. So this is the third in our series of 5 webinars this winter. So we've had a couple of great presentations so far. If you weren't able to attend those, they have been recorded, and those videos will be accessible to folks who are registered for the webinars. Some quick Zoom etiquette before I introduce our presenter for this evening. So if you would like to communicate amongst yourselves or just have comments about the presentation, you can go ahead and type those into the chat. Again, as Daisy mentioned, please toggle that button so that you can share with everyone rather than just with the panelists and the hosts. If you have questions for our presenter, we ask that you type those into the Q&A box, and that makes it easier for us to find them when we're ready to ask those questions. You can change the view on your screen. So I think it's up in the top right corner, if I remember correctly from viewing a webinar. So you can change your view so that it's side by side, or it has the pop out video, or you can even minimize the video so that you're just looking at that screen. And also if the chat box is popping up, you can move that chat box out of the way by dragging it off the screen. And all these webinars are being recorded, as I mentioned. So if you're registered for the webinar, we will send you a link to that video and the password to access it after the webinar. Okay, and I am excited now to introduce our presentation and presenter for this evening. So our topic tonight is the greater fritillary butterfly conservation in northern coastal California. And we have with us Clint Pogue, who's a biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Welcome, Clint.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, I'm super stoked to be here and excited to talk to you about the work that my office does for butterflies, specifically those listed under the Endangered Species Act.
Awesome. We're excited to hear all about it. Let me go ahead and stop my share so that you can go ahead and start yours.
Okay. Is my presentation looking good?
Yep, looks great. We can see it.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing conservation. Specifically, some of my focal areas are with the listed butterflies here in northern coastal California. My office's jurisdiction includes Del Norte, Humboldt, and Mendocino counties. So that's the majority of where I work. And I just wanted to give a little bit of background about my agency. We definitely don't have the most name recognition. And so I think it's important to sort of contextualize why we're doing this work. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service implements the Endangered Species Act of 1973, one of the most famous environmental laws of all time. And the purpose of the ESA is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems that they depend on. We co-administer the Endangered Species Act with the National Marine Fisheries Service. They sort of take care of everything in the ocean, and we take care of everything sort of from right where the beach starts inland. But really, I wanted to focus on these two words, protect and recover, because these are really sort of two branches that we work with at the service. The protection, that's sort of where we work with partners, other agencies, applicants. So whenever they're working on a project or they have an activity that they're doing, we can limit the negative impacts from that, or potentially, reduce those impacts altogether. And so we do that through habitat conservation plans, interagency consultation, and our permitting system. However, the other branch is recovery. So that's where we're actually focused on making things better for the species, not just keeping the habitat nice, but making the habitat nicer. Not just keeping animals on the landscape, but working to put more animals on the landscape. And that's really what this presentation is going to focus on, which is recovery. Since we're a government organization, we're accountable to the public. And one of the best ways to be accountable is to be transparent with what we're doing, what we want to do, and what criteria mean for certain things. So we have established recovery criteria, and these are quantifiable criteria where we can say, okay, if a species is endangered, these things need to happen until we can consider it threatened. If it's threatened, these things need to happen until we can consider taking it off the endangered species list. So some select recovery criteria, what these sort of look like for Oregon silverspot butterfly, is that there's at least 10 viable populations in protected habitat throughout the range. So there's, that's one criterion, but there's really sort of three things in there. There's 10 viable populations, those exist in protected habitat, and those are throughout the range. So some of these criteria are sort of multifaceted. Another criterion is habitats are managed long-term to maintain native early successional grassland communities. This is an example of one of a criterion where we're looking long-term. We recognize that we're going to have to be working with partners, and we're going to need agreements that the habitats are managed to maintain the habitats on which these species need, specifically for Oregon silverspot, those early successional grassland communities. And the final criterion I have here is that each population supports 200 to 500 butterflies for at least 10 years. And this one sort of like took me aback at first, because it's like it supports a minimum of a range. And then the more that I thought about that, it started to make more sense because some populations are just naturally bigger than others. You know, there's certain populations that exist across a wide span of habitat, whereas others are specifically limited. Like the habitat just could not grow any more than what it is. And so that's why we have this range of 200 to 500 butterflies as a minimum, so that we can tailor that per population, what makes sense for each area. And so I just wanted to provide that context on sort of like my agency, what we're trying to do, and how we're trying to do it. But let's jump into some more fun stuff and talk about actual butterflies. So butterflies are members of the order Lepidoptera. That includes both butterflies and moths. So if you've ever touched a butterfly or a moth and you've got that sort of like iridescent dust on your fingers, those are actually scales that cover the wings. And Lepidoptera means scale wing. And so lots of times people will sort of class out Lepidoptera into butterflies and moths. And while butterflies sort of make sense as a group, moths, they are systematically varied, way varied across the evolutionary timeline. And so moths are sort of a really artificial term that basically means not a butterfly, but in Lepidoptera. But specifically, talking about butterflies tonight. And this antiquated term that sort of lumps everything that we consider butterflies today is Rhopalocera, and that means clubhorn. So on 3 of these photos, you can see the ends of the antennae have a club at the end, and that's where we get clubhorn from Rhopalocera. And there's 7 families in Rhopalocera. 6 of those are in this sort of super family called Papilionoidea, and that's really the classic butterflies. That 7th family, the Hippolytiae, is really more what we call moth butterflies, and they're really interesting on their own right, but we're not talking about them tonight. But every organism in Lepidoptera undergoes this 4-stage life cycle: egg, larva or caterpillar, pupa, and then the imago or the adult. So jumping in, looking at some more butterfly taxonomy here. The butterflies we're going to be talking about today are in the family Nymphalidae, which are the brushfoot butterflies. And they're named this because they have a highly reduced pair of front legs. So if you look at the top photo, that's just a gorgeous Baltimore checker spot from Michigan. And you can see 2 large legs that it's standing on. And then just sort of a little bit out of focus and a little bit sort of like down from its chin, if you could consider butterflies having a chin, you can see that really reduced foreleg. So they're really sort of the T-Rexes of the butterfly world with those highly reduced front legs. And they're almost brush-like, and that's why they're called brushfoots. Lots of these butterflies are predominantly orange, red, brown, black, and then they can have silver, white, and pearlescent highlights, which is extremely striking in the field and also very hard to capture with the camera. The species is really diverse, both across species and within their forms as well. So, but specifically, we're going to be talking about one genus in particular, the greater fritillaries genus Speyeria. That's Speyeria. And these butterflies, every single one of them, every single member of the genus Speyeria, its larvae feed on the leaves of some type of violet. And so as we move into this, we'll see violets are a recurrent theme. You know, we always need violets. We always need dense violets. But here we have some great examples of the species Speyeria. In the upper left, we have a Hydaspes fritillary up at Horse Mountain, nectaring on some dogbane. And then in the upper right, regal fritillary, that's a butterfly that's obligate to the tallgrass prairies of the Midwest. In the bottom right, we have the great spangled butterfly. These are found throughout North America. And what's really unique about this species in particular is that they're sexually dimorphic, which is not common in the genus. So you can see one of them is sort of more chestnut red and another one is sort of more yellow brown. And that's even more on display when you can see their dorsal sides. So as I mentioned, all these butterflies are obligate to some type of violet. And so that's going to be central when I'm talking about this fritillary life cycle. So let's say that there's a fertilized female and she lays that egg. Over the next week or two, that egg will develop into a first instar caterpillar. And that caterpillar will then come out of the egg casing and actually eat that egg casing, pass one bit of frass, which is the entomological term for insect poop, and then start its diapause. It starts its diapause at that first instar caterpillar, and all caterpillars, moths, butterflies, they all pass through these different stages called instars, I-N-S-T-A-R. And those are really distinct stages in development where they'll shed their outer skin and grow substantially at each point. So they overwinter as this first instar caterpillar, and then spring comes and they start to feed on the leaves of violets, particularly the two butterflies I'll be talking today on the leaves of the early blue violet, Viola adunca. And so it makes evolutionary sense and biological sense why they would overwinter at this stage, because whenever they're that small, I mean, you can see they're just on the edge of that penny. They're extremely tiny at this first stage, and their mouth parts are also really tiny, and they can't really get around the thicker edges of some of the older violet leaves. So once the violets start to put on new growth in the spring, there's lots of tender leaves for these early young caterpillars to start to be able to feed upon. And then they will start to feed and get increasingly hungrier as time goes on. You've heard of the hungry caterpillar. They absolutely are very hungry, especially at the 5th and 6th instars. And you can see just why, how much they grow. In the lower left is a photo. We have the first instar, it's the size of the year on the penny, whereas the 6th instar goes all the way around. It looks like Godzilla in comparison. And then, so once it's fed all the way up through those 6th instars is whenever it starts to pupate. So it'll crawl up to an area and then start to make this J formation. And it will, for the last time, shed that outer layer of its skin, and then really enter the pupal form. So whenever I was a kid, I sort of thought like, okay, like the butterfly is sort of like in that pupal casing, and that's really only true right at the end. Like while it's a pupa, that's the organism, the whole organism. It is the pupa, and within that, it is nearly completely liquid within the exterior of the pupa, except for these small regions of cells called imaginal discs. And it's from those imaginal discs that the butterfly actually starts to form. Those are the seeds of the butterfly in the goop of the pupa. So after the butterfly pupates and totally metamorphosizes, then it sheds that pupal casing as a butterfly. But first, its abdomen is extremely swollen with hemolymph, and its wings are really reduced. So it will hang upside down and pump those wings full of that liquid, that hemolymph, until they're fully inflated, and then it will continue to hang upside down until they dry and the cuticle forms. So that's the last thing that the butterfly needs to do before it starts to go look for nectar and go look for mates. So typically, especially in the genus Speyeria, males will emerge first and find areas that are good nectaring habitats, which is likely where they already are. But also, they're just, prowling for when the females start to eclose. Because oftentimes, in this genus, the males will find the females as soon as they've eclosed and mate with them immediately, even before they've had a chance to inflate their wings and fly. So it's advantageous to the males for them to emerge first. So let's actually start talking about some of the butterflies that we work with at our office. The Oregon silverspot butterfly, Speyeria zerene hippolyta. It's found in grassland habitats within 12 miles of the Pacific coast. from Southwest Washington all the way to Northwest California. And it's found in 3 different habitat types: coastal prairies, stabilized dunes, and montane grasslands. This butterfly is what we consider univoltine. Uni being one, voltine being flight. That means there's only one time per year where these butterflies actually exist in the adult form where they can fly around. Some butterflies have multiple generations per year. Lots of attention is given to the monarch for its amazing multi-generational migratory life history. But the monarch's life history is actually really atypical and not representative of most of the butterflies, especially most of the at-risk butterflies. As I mentioned before, the caterpillars of this butterfly are obligate to Viola adunca, and it's not migratory. This whole butterfly, you can stand in one spot and see its whole world. Unfortunately, there used to be a lot more expansive habitat, but in today's world, oftentimes a human can see the butterfly's whole world from standing just on top of one of the stabilized dunes up at Lake Earl. So let's take a look sort of at how this species is doing range-wide. And I know this is a very busy slide, but there's just a few takeaways that I'd like to focus on here. Okay, first is the map on the right. We can see the distribution of the extant native populations of Oregon silverspot butterfly. Those are represented by the butterflies, but the extirpated locations vastly outnumber that, and those are the blue X's. So we can really see how many populations that we've lost. But then looking at actual population numbers on the left, you can see that many of those are also in decline. This is something that since 2001 we've been combating through captive rearing and augmentation, something I'll be talking about later in the presentation. And also we've done 2 reintroductions, or 1 introduction and 1 reintroduction. And so we're working on increasing the number of populations and also increasing the numbers of butterflies at each of these. One thing I'd like to point out is that we have 1 population that is doing exceptionally well. If you look around 1999, the peak, it looks to be about 1,400, but actually for that population, we had to put on another y-axis on the right. That population was around 5,000 butterflies in 1999. Currently, that population is hovering around 1,700, which is still substantially less, but a lot more than those other populations. And that serves as sort of a source population for us to collect individuals, do the captive rearing and augmentation specifically from that population. So looking back at that map, you can see in California, our population is substantially disjunct from the other populations. And it's not just unique geographically, we also have some unique issues that we're dealing with. So this population, the one in California, is found at Tolowa Dunes State Park, Lake Earl Wildlife Area. There's also been historical populations near Camp Park, which is currently a roadside park just south of Brookings. There's still some violets there. You can see why this butterfly used to be there, and you can also see why it's no longer there. There's just not enough habitat. And then we also have multiple sightings reported from around Point St. George. There's lots of violets out on Point St. George, but it's really exposed to wind. And so these butterflies might be using it temporarily, but those extremely windy conditions make it hard for the butterflies to complete their life cycle. If you're ever out doing a butterfly survey and it's a windy day, you're unlikely to count a single butterfly because the wind can really pick them up and take them really far away, change their whole world. And so it's really advantageous for them to stay hunkered down in the wind. But not only, as I mentioned, is this population geographically distinct, it's also genetically distinct. In 2016, there was a mitochondrial DNA study that found that the Lake Earl population was substantially distinct genetically, mitochondrially, from all of the other populations. And so that's why in 2017, the alarm bells really started to go off for multiple reasons, honestly. But as looking at these population numbers, these are from population index counts. So these aren't necessarily population estimates, but this is just the number of butterflies that we were counting along our transects. As you can see, in 2008, we had an amazing year, so many butterflies, nearly 900. And then that started to decline sort of steadily through 2015, where we had 247, which was, not alarming for us because butterfly populations and insect populations in general can undergo boom and bust years. And so this was not totally out of the range of expectations. However, the next year was the lowest count that we had on record. And so this is sort of whenever I started my work with the service. I came on in January of 2017, and we conducted the first count that year in 2017 and counted only 7 butterflies. And this was, extremely disturbing and honestly terrifying, to come into this and to see so little to work with, and also to realize just exactly what we're losing here. So we want to know sort of, okay, we saw this gradual decline followed by a really precipitous decline. What's going on? Well, almost always whenever we have a species in decline, habitat loss and habitat degradation are the initial causes. So when there's less habitat in general, less contiguity of that habitat, so it's less connected, and the habitat's less quality, there's just less resources out there. So if you could imagine that the violets and the nectar are the ingredients that we need to make butterflies, there's just less violets and nectar out there, so there's going to be less butterflies. But really, it's like, why is there less violets and nectar? Well, one of the reasons is that habitat up there is currently being heavily encroached by willows, conifers, and European beach grass. And so that's really sort of what starts the decline. Is we have less available habitat, and that habitat is less available to the butterflies, sometimes due to fragmentation. So first, I want to talk about sort of this weird magenta polygon that I have here on the top and bottom. That outlines this area of really nice, like a microcosm of habitat that I would walk through on the way to one of the butterfly transects. And I always wondered, I was like, okay, like, why is this awesome habitat totally surrounded by these willows? Like, how did that happen? And so I actually mapped it out, walked the boundaries, brought that into Google Earth, and then brought it here and looked at what that habitat looked like in previous aerial imagery. And I could see that there was a lot more open habitat than there currently exists previously. And so I realized, there's a lot of encroachment going on, and I was starting to learn more about the area. Historically, Tolowa Dunes State Park, Lake Earl Wildlife Area was ranch land. And however you feel about grazing, it does a couple things that are really good for butterflies. One, it keeps the vegetation low, and 2, it reduces the thatch. So the butterflies need some level of thatch on the landscape, because that's where they'll actually lay their eggs, on the thatch adjacent to the violets. But when the thatch is really dense, as you could imagine, if you've been out to the dunes, been out in the European beach grass, the thatch under that is incredibly dense. So dense that 1, a caterpillar really can't move across it from violet to violet, and 2, that the adults even have a hard time getting down into the grass and laying the eggs close enough to the violets. But let's take another look at just how this habitat's changed over the years. So these are really similar images, or the location is the same, of Pacific shores. So as I mentioned, this used to be ranch land, but in the 1960s, this area was purchased by a man named Andrew Tell. And he took this ranch land, subdivided it up into, many hundreds of parcels, and then sold those parcels to unsuspecting people from Southern California, Hawaii, the East Coast, saying, hey, come build your dream home on the Pacific Ocean. And then whenever people arrived to build their homes, they realized, oh, this is wetland. Like, I can't build a foundation here. My house is just going to sink into the ground. And so this was a failed subdivision and something that we're still struggling with. So those roads are still out there. Some of the parcels are still privately owned, but you can really see how much the vegetation has changed over those years because the grazing is gone. And also the hydrology has been altered by that road network, because associated with those roads came ditches. And those ditches lowered the water table, and you can really see easily on the left photo of the willows growing in those ditches, and those are serving as barriers to have for butterfly movement. A butterfly, basically this just created a crisscross of hurdles, because if a butterfly comes up to a string of willows, they don't know if there's any good habitat on the other side. They might turn around and see decent habitat behind them, and so why would they ever leave? So basically, this has just created a massive inhibition to butterfly movement to any areas that are still good out there, but also it's encroaching on the areas that are still good too. So we have a lot to battle with the habitat change. But that sort of explains the gradual decline, because we're gradually losing habitat. But what about going from the 89 to 7? Like, that was a sharp decline. And so another reason that we think for this decline is the changing climate. So in 2011 to 2017, we had that prolonged drought. And during that time, it's likely that the violets were not able to thrive out in the habitat, because these violets require some level of moisture in the soil. And so over time, the ground got drier, we got less rain, and the violets became less dense and less vigorous, and just in fewer places out on the landscape. So, as I said before, less resources, less butterflies. So with the reduction of violets, we started to get less and less butterflies. But then that was juxtaposed with the extremely wet winter in 2016, 2017. And that flooded out lots of those wetter habitats where the violets were actually able to hang on. And that's also where the caterpillars were hanging on. So the flooding in those habitats likely drowned lots of the remaining caterpillars that we had out there. And this is the event that we really think caused that truly precipitous decline in the species. But that's not letting us, not trying to get too down on that. We're actually, we recognize the issue, and we're working with a two-pronged approach to actually make this better. First up, habitat restoration, because the species can't exist without its habitat. So as I mentioned before, this is a stabilized dune swale complex that was previously ranch land. And so our goal is to get rid of some of these invasive species and reconnect what were two previous hotspots of Oregon silverspot butterfly, because it's our thinking that since these were the last two sort of holdout areas for the butterfly, it's going to be easiest to get that habitat back into shape, because it's the habitat that was most recently supporting the butterflies. So we determined this connection corridor using these two hotspots, and then a little bit of habitat modeling, which you can see on the right, with the warmer colors representing better habitat. So it's not the best habitat that we're using currently to connect these two, but we think that it's with a little bit of biological intuition and getting out on the landscape, that this is going to make the most sense for the butterfly, because it will actually have a straight line path between these two hotspots, and it won't have to navigate any sort of that willow complex. So our strategy for this habitat restoration starts with beach grass removal. We have California Conservation Corps and CAL FIRE crews out there doing initial treatments and retreatments. We can see in the picture in the upper left just what it looks like right after an initial treatment. You see that really thick old growth beach grass on the right, and it's just been demolished on the left, which is great to see, but it requires repeated retreatments to keep that beach grass at bay and to eventually get the habitat such that we can start to do the violet plantings. So we don't want to put the violets right into the beach grass because we're going to be coming and pulling that beach grass again, and that might be disrupting the violets. So once the habitat starts looking better, we're able to plant these violets, and we're currently doing a few different experimental designs to try to find the best recipe for habitat restoration. And so one of these aspects is planting the violets both with and without companion plants. So in the upper right, you can see we have a meter square quadrat where we would plant a violet, and then on one side, sand dune sedge, and on the other side, a red fescue. And these plants serve two purposes. One, that's helped to keep the moisture in around the violet, because we know that they need substantial moisture, and we see that violets are often growing with some sort of companion. So we think that retaining that moisture is going to be essential. But also, the butterflies, they often lay their eggs on the thatch right next to the violet. So we're putting in plugs of plants that produce good thatch without getting too tall and too rank. But it's not just the caterpillars that need the food. The adults need it too. And so since the adults are nectivorous, we're putting out nectar plants. Up until recently, one of the main nectar sources for Oregon silverspot in Del County has been tansy ragwort, which is an invasive species. And it's just been far and away the biggest preference for that butterfly. And so right now we're working on transitioning from that non-native invasive nectar source to more native nectar sources, including yarrow, gum plants, goldenrods, pearly everlasting, California aster. And each of those plants, is its own unique species. So we're seeing which ones grow the best on various slopes, aspects, micro elevations, moisture content, and then we'll be able to take that data and implement that across that whole region of our vision area. And as I mentioned, we're doing this with experimental design. My colleague at State Parks, Keith Slauson, has a very rigorous statistical experimental design. So we're really going to be able to have some numbers to back this up. And that's going to really help us scale this work intelligently and know that, for every dime we have, we're making it go as far as possible because funding is always limited. So while we're getting the habitat ready, we also want to try to make sure that we're keeping butterflies out there. Over the past few years, unfortunately, you really haven't been seeing too many Oregon silverspot butterflies, but that hasn't kept us from trying to get up to speed and make sure that we'll be ready if we do find some to be able to do captive propagation. So captive propagation is a way for us to bolster populations against natural mortality. So the eggs, the larvae, the pupa, those are the most vulnerable life stages. And basically we bring them into captivity, and that reduces their natural mortality by protecting them at those vulnerable stages. And it relies on females that we collect in the wild. We bring them in, and then they lay eggs throughout their end of their life while they're cared for. And then we're able to raise those all the way either to the caterpillar, pupa, or adult stage for release in the field. So we do releases at each of the 3 stages depending on the specific goals and specific restrictions that we have for each habitat type. So sort of the timeline of what this looks like is a fertilized female is captured in the wild. She's brought to the zoo and cared for there. Over the past few years, we've worked extensively with Sequoia Park Zoo to make sure that their captive rearing program is as robust as possible. They've been learning from Oregon Zoo and Woodland Park Zoo in Oregon that have been doing Oregon silverspot captive rearing augmentation since 2001. And so we had a really, great base of people to learn from up there. So this whole cookbook for butterflies, what I'm going through now, was developed by Oregon Zoo and Woodland Park Zoo. So these butterflies are brought in, placed in paper bags. There's a violet leaf in there so that the smell of the violet leaf sort of stimulates the butterfly to want to lay eggs. And then she'll lay eggs on the cut up strands of paper towels, which is meant to simulate that sort of thatch. And so if you look at the bottom left photo, you can actually see an instance where the butterfly laid eggs actually on the violet leaf. And so you can really get an appreciation for how small these eggs are. While the female is continuing to lay eggs, she's provided high quality food and enrichment to make sure that she's as healthy and happy as possible. So the food that we feed is this Nectar Plus, which is full of energy and also vitamins. It has shown to dramatically increase the egg output of the females, so that each female that we bring in, we're getting as many eggs from her as possible. Once those eggs have been laid on the paper towels, they're inspected for mold and then each cut out individually. If you look at the lower right, you'll see those brown triangles, and I don't know if this is coming across now, but there's a dark spot in the center of each of those, and that's the developing butterfly egg. So as I mentioned before, those caterpillars will hatch, eat that egg casing, and then overwinter as a first instar caterpillar. And we have a specific caterpillar diapause chamber, which is a specifically regulated refrigerator at Sequoia Park Zoo. In the spring, the caterpillars are brought out of diapause, and then that's whenever a lot of work starts. Because as I mentioned before, these caterpillars get extremely hungry. And especially at these first instars, while they're not hungry, they require those really small, delicate leaves. And so being able to harvest enough of those small, new delicate leaves takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. So the zoo has relied on volunteers to help with violet leaf harvest. If you're interested in volunteering, I'll have my email at the end. Send me an email and I'll get you connected with Chris Damiani at the zoo. She's the one that is the butterfly technician. She is a caterpillar mom. She takes extremely great care of the butterflies and the caterpillars, and honestly has been an extreme joy to work with. The work that she does is phenomenal. I can't say thank you enough to Chris. She's amazing. So once the caterpillars have fed on those violet leaves and progressed through each of their 6 instars, they will start to pupate. So in the lower right, you can see sort of how we get this set up. There's a paper towel square that's taped to the edge of the caterpillar chamber, and the caterpillars will then climb up there and start that J formation where they'll pupate. Then we can fold that paper towel square into what's called a pupa pocket, which is sort of, it cushions the pupa for transport, but then also it allows us to track each pupa individually when we release them. So the upper left photo is a caterpillar release cage. Imagine it's sort of like a collapsible laundry hamper, but more specialized. In there, there's a 5-gallon bucket, and inside that, these pupa pockets have been taped so that they can eclose. And then that mesh cage, there's a small opening unzipped that allows them to escape with some flowers on the outside. And also we include this tree tube across the opening, and that's to keep out avian predators, because predation is a major issue with these releases, and is one reason why we might elect to release adults in the next butterfly that I'm going to be talking about, the Behren silverspot. So Behren silverspot, it's Speyeria zerene behrensii. So if you remember the Oregon silverspot, that was Speyeria zerene hippolyta. These are 2 subspecies of Speyeria zerene. So their life histories are really similar, but geographically found in different locations. The Behrens is found in southern Mendocino and northern Sonoma counties. It's also univoltine. Its caterpillars also eat that same violet. It doesn't migrate, and we've had consistently low counts of this butterfly. So thinking back to Oregon silverspot, we had historical populations from Southwest Washington to Northwest California. This butterfly, 2 counties in California total. So a really restricted range. The first place that it was observed was near the town of Mendocino. And we have existing populations at Manchester State Park, Point Arena Stornetta Unit, which is Bureau of Land Management lands, and Salt Point State Park, which is the Sonoma County population. We're uncertain about some of these other populations because, frankly, it's hard to get down there to keep tabs on these. And so we continue to want to explore Stewart's Point, Navarro Point, and Sea Ranch as potential places where either the butterfly is persisting, might have been previously, or might have suitable habitat in general. So thinking back to the Oregon silverspot numbers we had, there was one population that most recently had about 1,700 butterflies. This is the total number of butterflies that we counted per year for Behren silverspot. And with the most that we ever counted was 33 butterflies. And that's the most that we've ever seen. But in 2020, we saw 0. And so that was really what alarmed me. I got this assignment in late 2019, and then in 2020, we didn't see any. So, it's just deja vu all over again from Oregon silverspot, where, I get this assignment and the butterfly is doing terribly. Am I cursed? I don't know. But I just, went into focus mode. It's like, okay, we need to figure out what's going on here. So first, let's talk about maybe how we got here, why this butterfly is doing so poorly. So one of the reasons for decline, as with Oregon silverspot, is there's just less habitat available. Less available habitat, less butterflies. But why is there less habitat? Well, one, the habitat that these butterflies persist in is extremely beautiful coastal habitat in Mendocino County. Like, it's just some of the most beautiful areas you could ever imagine, and people want to build their houses there. Unfortunately, we have traded butterfly homes for people homes in Mendocino and Sonoma counties, and that's really reduced the amount of habitat available for this butterfly. Also, there's legacy land use impacts. If we look at this sort of olive green blob on the left, that's actually LiDAR imagery of some of the land in Mendocino. And I'm not sure if this detail is going to come across by streaming my screen, but there are furrows in the landscape that go perpendicular to the coast. And those were created for agricultural reasons, to drain the land, to make the land drier, for whatever agricultural reason they wanted to do that. But whenever that was done, that permanently changed the hydrology of these areas, changed the soil. And as we talked about with Oregon silverspot, those violets need a certain level of moisture. And so these legacy land use impacts are really inhibiting our abilities to do some restoration out there. But climate change is also impacting Behren silverspot, because we're having longer, drier years with less nectar. So our goal now is to do the same two things. First up, habitat restoration. We're doing invasive grass removal. That was beach grass in Del Norte County. In Mendocino, it's velvet grass and sweet vernal grass. And we're doing that with grazing and mowing. We have sheep and goats out there, and that's really reducing those invasive grasses, which then allows us to do violet planting. Just a couple weekends ago, State Parks was able to plant 2,100 violets across 2 days at Salt Point State Park. And then upcoming, we're going to focus on increasing the nectar. But one thing that is always going to be a challenge is restoring that hydrology that I mentioned before. And then captive propagation. In 2020, we saw no butterflies on survey. There was one incidental sighting. So in 2021, we had all the permits, funding, and logistics in place that if we saw any of these butterflies, we'd be able to collect them. We were fortunate enough to be able to collect 7 female Behren silverspots from July and August, and they laid nearly 2,900 eggs. 1,500 of those hatched, and currently 928 of those are surviving as of last week. So there is substantial mortality, but much less mortality than there would be in nature. And as I mentioned before, we're planning to release these as adults because we want to maximize the survivorship for the amount that we're putting out there. Because while we while that 2021 survey index was 0, whenever we were looking in other places that didn't have transects, we're actually seeing more butterflies. We probably saw about 40 to 50 total butterflies this year, which is, about 40 to 50 or 40 or 50 more than I anticipated we would see. So that was extremely good news, even though it is also extremely dire news. So as I mentioned before, we are accountable to the public, and it's important that we communicate our recovery criteria. But looking at these, you can see we're very far away from meeting these just downlisting criteria. So these are the criteria to reclassify the butterfly from endangered to threatened. We need 3 metapopulations in Mendocino County and 1 population in Sonoma County. All right, we're already far from that. We're not even close. And the range-wide population of 8,000 adults. Compare that to maybe the 50 that we saw this year. You can see that we have an extremely long way to go. We are focused on the path, not the destination right now. In my vision for this, I think it's the best idea to see where the butterflies are doing the best and try to get as many butterflies in there as we can. Create, do habitat restoration, but basically create a butterfly paradise where we have a butterfly source where, okay, we have enough butterflies from this one location that we can start doing reintroductions to other suitable locations. And, but where are those other locations? We have some of the historical data, but one thing I wanted to know was, are there any places where 1, there's suitable habitat that we're not keeping tabs on, or 2, potentially butterfly populations that we're not aware of? So we did a bit of habitat modeling. We collaborated with an intern at then HSU, Faith Reagan. She was amazing to work with. And basically what we did was we took a computer program, told it where we had been seeing these butterflies, and then gave it various layers of information that said, okay, this is what the fog looks like over this area. This is what the soil looks like across this area. Wind speed, vegetation, land cover. And then the computer program was able to look at the locations where we had the butterfly, look at those layers and see what the sort of sandwich of layers looked like. And it was sort of like, okay, these are what the sandwiches look like where the butterflies are seen. Are there any other places where there's similar looking sandwiches out on the landscape? And so this area that has the most elevated habitat suitability, the warmest colors, that's really where the butterfly locations have been. But that northern area that has a little bit of warmer colors, we have not had any butterfly detections that we fed into the model from there. But what was really exciting was I showed this to someone, my colleague at State Parks, Tara Fuller, and she says, oh, that's where we saw that one Speyeria that we couldn't identify back in 2008. And so that was extremely exciting because, I mean, the most parsimonious answer is that it was a Behrens, but regardless of if it was Behrens or not, it was a Speyeria, and that means there's violets around. So it gave the model a little bit of independent validation and also me a lot of excitement for that area. I was able to check it out a little bit last year. Unfortunately, that day was extremely foggy, not good for butterflies. So going to be following up on that in 2022 while we're working on our releases. But there's other Speyeria that are also at risk. There's myrtle silverspot. That's also another zerene fritillary. And Point Reyes silverspot, not listed, but it only occurs around Point Reyes. And then we have Calliope fritillary, another endangered species. It's a different species than these others, but we can see this theme. There's lots of butterflies that are at risk, and we can be doing something about that because it's all coming down to the violets. This is sort of the bigger picture that I want to be the takeaway of the presentation. It's like sometimes rare species depend on a common resource. And Viola dunca, not a rare plant, but looking at the map, we can see it's found throughout California. But the rarity is where it exists in abundance. And so if there's a common, not hard to find organism, but it exists in abundance, that's worth protecting because we don't know what else might be relying on the abundance of that common resource. So I'd like to take the time just to thank my partners, because this would be absolutely impossible without them. Just I've really enjoyed working with every single one of my partners at all of these organizations, and I can't say thank you enough to any of them. But I'm running a little out of time, so with that, I'll take any questions that people have.
Wow, that was perfect timing, and just so much wonderful information. Thank you, Clint. There's like a lot of comments just about how fascinating all of this is. So yeah, I'd like to remind people that if you have questions for Clint, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A right now. We're getting close to 7 p.m. here, but we'll stick around for a little bit to ask any questions that anyone might have. And as people are doing that, yeah, so I just had a couple things that like stuck out to me. First of all, the idea of them as T-Rex butterflies just like really resonated with me and stuck in my head. I think I'll remember that one for a while because they have the little short arms. But yeah, learned some new words today for sure. Like I hadn't really heard the word nectivorous before, but that is a good one. Yeah, makes sense. They eat nectar, so they're nectivorous. But yeah, so super interesting stuff. I don't see anything popping up just yet. I did see a comment of somebody had said when you were showing the picture of that big fancy house, of look at that lawn, and then it said to have people plant violets in their yard. And I just wonder if that's something that could potentially be helpful to butterflies in that area, since you said it's a lot of private property.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as long as those violets are planted, if they're not spraying their lawn, for weeds, because herbicides and insecticides obviously would not be very good for them. But that's certainly something that we're interested in, is partnering with private individuals and helping them to get the violets they need to plant. So that's something that we're pursuing.
Nice.
I think we have a question in the chat box from Griff. How many Viola species can support either of these butterfly species?
It's just Viola adunca that's known to support these two. But looking at Speyeria in general, sometimes they can be a little bit more generalist and feed on other kinds of violets. So these are almost always associated with Viola adunca, but I think that if you had them in captivity and you gave them some Viola glabella leaves, they'd probably eat them.
Yeah, interesting that at the zoo they're feeding them like a hummingbird food, it looked like. That nectar plus said something about hummingbirds on it.
Yeah, that's an import from Germany, so they're getting high quality food.
Ooh. I had a question about, while we wait for other questions, I'll throw in one of my own. So you mentioned that you capture the butterflies fertilized. How do you know that they're fertilized?
I mean, that's a great question, and we can't tell for sure that they are. But males, they'll tend to try to fertilize a female before she can even fly away. So it's likely that if there's enough out there that she's fertilized. But there is something that you can look at once you've captured to see if the female has been laying eggs. And as she lays each egg, they have a little bit of moisture around them. And then that moisture dries and there'll be a crust that builds up at the end of the abdomen. And that sort of shows, okay, they've been laying eggs. With the Oregon silverspot, unfortunately, we were able to collect one in 2018, and she had been laying eggs. There was that crust developed, but she had not been fertilized, unfortunately. She laid 150 non-fertile eggs.
Whoa, so they can lay unfertilized ones, and like chickens.
Yeah.
So cool.
Okay, we do have a question in the Q&A from Victoria. How did you make the habitat map for Taloa Dunes?
I did the same that I had laid out with the Behren silverspot. I used Maxent habitat modeling with similar environmental variables. But then I just overlaid that on some imagery for that map that I showed.
Okay, cool. Pacific Shores is such an interesting place. I haven't been there yet, but.
Oh my, yeah, I know. I sort of want to like write like a local history about it because there's a lot going on there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the plovers are liking that spot too lately.
Mhm.
Over here.
So we have another question. Does anyone sell the seeds, I'm presuming of the violet, at least to the neighbors of some of the hot spots?
Well, we found the most success with plugs, and we work with Samara here in McKinleyville to source a lot of those plugs, specifically for the Lake Earl Delnort population, and then for Behren silverspot, we have partners that grow those plugs. So we don't have currently a seed source, but definitely plug sources that would be happy to sell you any of those as well.
Well, Samara is so awesome.
They really are.
Yeah, Samara Restoration is great. This is a commercial for Samara Restoration. They donated some beach pines to Friends of the Dunes that we planted out on our property, which is great.
Nice.
I wonder too if the California Native Plant Society might be a good source, because I know at least locally they do have a native plant sale twice a year. I'm not sure if I've seen that particular species, but I haven't really been looking for it, so it's possible. I had a quick question about the timeline. So you were saying you've got those, I guess maybe they're in larva stage right now of the butterflies, the Behren's butterflies, that you're going to be reintroducing. So what's the timeline on reintroduction for those?
We're looking at late July, early August to put the adults out there. So it'll depend on sort of what they do at the zoo. This is the first time that the zoo has worked with Behren silverspots, and so there are some certain unknowns on development speed, but we have a little bit of control over that with temperature and food. So we're going to be shooting for putting these butterflies out there when the wild butterflies are already out there, and so we were seeing them in late July, early August in the most dense numbers this year. We'll be shooting for that in 2022.
Okay, great. And so sorry if I missed that, but are those butterflies also at Sequoia Park Zoo, or are they at a Mendocino Zoo?
Nope, they're at Sequoia Park Zoo, and as March comes along in April, you'll be able to go to the zoo, and then in the barnyard exhibit, you'll be able to see some of these endangered caterpillars crawling around. So please go see them. It's really amazing to watch them just crawl around and be like, oh wow, like, there's probably less than 100 of these butterflies in the world, and you're gonna be able to see, that many right there as caterpillars, which is pretty amazing.
Wow, that's awesome. Very cool. In the chat, we also got a confirmation from Karen that they will have a few of those violet species at the spring CNPS sale. So
Excellent.
I guess we don't have any populations down here though, so it's not that helpful for people in Manila to plant them. Well,
like I said before, there's other Speyeria that like these violets. So especially if you live more inland, that's where you'll find more Speyeria in Humboldt County. And so, the Hydaspes, the Great Basin fritillaries, they'll all be happy to have Viola dunked out in your garden, or any other kind of violet too.
Oh yeah, or gifts to friends that live near hotspots. Griff just added to our chat.
Oh.
If you know people in Mendocino too, buy them some violets. Okay, cool. So I think that wraps up our questions. Clint, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We really appreciate all this great information. I feel like I'm gonna have to watch it again myself just to soak in all that great information and the cool maps that you showed. Yeah, and hopefully maybe someday we can get an update that the breeding is going and reintroduction is going successfully. I'd love to hear that in a year or so.
I sure hope so. I would love to give that presentation and to be able to deliver that news. Yeah, so fingers crossed.
Yeah, we'll all put good thoughts that way for those butterflies.
Thanks, Susie. And thanks for inviting me and having me out to do this. It was a blast, honestly.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
to everybody still hanging out here, just a quick reminder, we've got 2 more webinars coming up. So if you just registered for this one, it's not late to join us for those next ones. Next week's going to be Bats of the Lanfear Dunes. So I'm excited to learn about that too. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here. Hope to see you next week.
Thanks, Clint.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Clint.
Bye.
Bye.